I was aware that some of the things that I was doing were not legal. I'd be lying if I told you otherwise. I knew some of them were illegal. I kind of just, I was just like I was weaving my own spider web. I couldn't get out of it. I was in a hole too deep. I should have. It's easy now for me to look back and say, gosh, why didn't I just say, forget it, don't bother me anymore. But as I said earlier, I can only attribute it to being immature, to being overly ambitious. And I've asked myself 1,000 times, why did I do it?
In the Senate of the United States, a resolution to establish a select committee of the Senate to conduct an investigation and study of the extent, if any, to which illegal, improper, or unethical activities were engaged in by any persons, acting individually or in combination with others, in the presidential election of 1972, or any campaign, canvass, or other activity related to it. From Washington, NPAC brings you gavel-to-gavel videotape coverage of today's hearings by the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. Here is NPAC correspondent Jim Lehrer.
Good evening. Two $150 a month political saboteurs gave full but very different confessional performances today. Like their leader, Donald Segretti, yesterday, Martin Douglas Kelly was apologetic and remorseful in his appearance before the Irvin Committee. Kelly made no effort to justify his bad deeds, which ranged from planting stink bombs to paying a girl to run around in the nude in front of Edmund Muskie's hotel. But Robert Benz was a different story. His list of tricks included stink bombs, as well as recruiting infiltrators, hecklers, and pickets, and sending out phony letters and press releases. Kelly, who is 24, said, as you just saw, that his own immaturity and ambition, which he translated into the possibility of landing a job in Washington after the election, caused him to join the Segretti Dirty Tricks team. The 25-year-old Benz, on the other hand, said he joined because he felt it was a good way to give the Democrats a dose of their own medicine. His hindsight reflections about it all were much different than Kelly's, to say the least. As you will see, the contrast in style and mood between the two young Republicans from Florida is also marked and obvious. Peter Kay will be back at the close of tonight's replay with journalist-author Jules Witkover, and as we've been doing each night, here is Impact's hour-by-hour viewing guide. In the first hour, Martin Kelly explains how he placed radio ads linking Senator Muskie and Fidel Castro. They were broadcast on Spanish-speaking stations in Miami. He said the false ads were meant to insult the Cuban population. Also in that hour, Kelly is asked if he considers his pranks as part and parcel of American politics. He answers no. His work went beyond the scope of normal political pranks. In the second hour, Kelly tells how he paid a female student $20 to take off her clothes and walk by a Gainesville, Florida hotel where Senator Muskie was staying. She was to shout, "I love Muskie." Also in that hour, Robert Benz takes the stand and tells how he hired infiltrators to work in the campaign headquarters of Senators Muskie and Jackson. In hour 3, Benz gets into arguments with the senators on what are proper and ethical campaign practices. Benz claims that there has always been what he calls opponent research in political campaigns and asks why other elections have not been probed as deeply as this one. Senator Irvin counters by charging that never has there been such rascality on a national scale in a political campaign. Now to the hearing room as Senator Irvin gavels the committee to order.
Committee will come to order. I'm sorry I had to go to the Commerce Committee. It was imperative, and I was in hopes that the senior member of the Vice Chairman would open the meeting and go on. I have to hope they will, if I'm not here. Council will call the first witness.
Mr. Chairman, the first witness is Mr. Martin Douglas Kelly, and he will be interrogated by Mr. Terry Lensner, the Assistant Chief Counsel. Mr. Kelly does have immunity. You might want to speak to that.
Suppose you stand up, Mr. Kelly. Raise your right hand. Do you swear that the evidence that you shall give to the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Now let the record show that Mr. Kelly is testifying involuntarily under an order of immunity entered by Chief Judge John J. Sirica of the United States District Court for the District of Columbia under sections 6002 and 6005 of Title 18 of the United States Code, and that such order was entered by Judge Sirica at the unanimous request of the Senate Select Committee. Counsel may proceed.
We have an
Mr. Kelly, do you have counsel with you? Could you identify yourself, counsel, please?
Yes, sir. Ms. Lenzner, Philip K. Beck. I'm a practicing attorney in Lakeland, Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Beck. Mr. Kelly, you have a short statement. Would you go ahead and read that, please?
My name is Martin Douglas Kelly. I'm 24 years old, live in Miami, Florida, and was born in Fukuoka, Japan. I've previously been heavily involved in Florida College Republican and Young Republican activities statewide. There have been several political campaigns that I have participated in to varied extents and capacities since 1968. 2 years ago, I was approached by a man identifying himself as Donald Simmons, asking me to join him in political ventures relating to negative campaigning, or as it's currently more popularly termed, dirty tricks. My participation in these activities was on my own volition, and I was initially paid a modest salary for the purpose of causing confusion, disruption, and malcontent amongst the Democratic presidential primary candidates. After participating in some of the aforementioned activities, either by myself or with Mr. Segretti, alias Donald Simmons, I was to be paid $700 monthly for activities to take place just before, during, and after the Democratic National Convention in Miami Beach. No provocations, illegalities, or dirty pranks were carried out that summer because of the Watergate break-in and the heat of the investigations that followed. My varied political ventures relating to these activities took place, therefore, sometime between December 1971 to about April or May 1972, or a period of approximately 6 months. I have provided this committee with a verbal report on all that I can recall that was done for Mr. Segretti, with Mr. Segretti, or on my own volition. I very deeply regret the political and personal damage incurred by the senators, their families, and staff members while running for higher office as a result of my activities. It's my hope that young people will continue to enter politics in high school and college. What political future I may have had has been virtually wiped out by what I did and was involved in. Those who live by the sword die by the sword, and I feel that these hearings can serve no better function than to exemplify the necessity of keeping our political system free of the things that can make politics corrupt and eventually ineffective. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, how long have you lived in Miami?
I've lived in Miami about 10 of the last 11 years, approximately.
And how are you presently employed, sir?
Right now I'm employed with my father. We're starting a business in Florida.
Now, did that call that you referred to from Mr. Simmons come in the fall of 1971?
Yes, sir, it did.
And can you tell the committee what the substance of that phone call was?
Yes, sir. Mr. Segretti called, identifying himself as Donald Simmons, saying he was referred, he had been referred to me by a Mr. Smith, whom I did not know, or didn't know who he was talking about. He said he wanted to meet with me, have lunch, and discuss the possibility of my helping him in something political. I wasn't sure what. He asked me who my choice was for president was, and I told him I was for Nixon.
Now, shortly after that, you did meet with him, and can you relate that conversation?
Yes, sir. It didn't take much time. I suppose the lunch was 45 minutes, an hour, something of that sort. We discussed my background, my political background, and he asked me what I thought about negative campaigning, was the way he put it. I expressed interest in it, unfortunately, and when I asked him about his background, he was pretty evasive. He only mentioned that he was a graduate of Yale. He was 29. That he was from a very wealthy family that was interested in getting involved in the election.
Did he explain what negative campaigning was, or did you have some idea of that?
Well, I had a pretty good idea of what it was. I didn't, of course, understand the scope of what he meant, but I knew that I certainly knew what positive campaigning was, and I had seen some negative campaigning in previous campaigns to a much less degree, but I had a pretty good idea of what he meant.
And did you agree to work for Mr. Simmons as you knew him at that time?
Yes, sir. In a way, it wasn't like you were hired at that particular time. He said he would get back in touch with me in a week or 10 days. He gave me some money. I don't remember the exact amount, $40, $50, $60, something of that sort. And he recontacted me by phone about a week or 10 days later.
And did you arrive at an agreement for compensation for your work?
Pardon me?
Did you arrive at a agreement for compensation for your work?
Yes. $150 I was to be paid initially for the first few months, and then he said we would work something out later as to more.
And did he specify a figure for your work to be done later?
Well, not at that time, no. Later the figure was set at $700. It was to start about about May or June. It was to run before the convention, during the convention, and also some post-convention activities. By convention, I mean the National Democratic Convention in Miami Beach. I think was held in July.
Now, prior to Mr. Simmons calling and meeting with you, did you know an individual by the name of Harry DeVant?
Yes, sir. I had met Mr. DeVant in young Republican politics. He was local. He was also in Miami. I knew that in 1968 he had been an advance man for President Nixon's campaign. And I knew him socially, mostly. For sometime in 71, I can't place the exact time or date, but it was 1971, I think, that he began getting involved in young Republican politics, which I was also involved in.
Now, a short time ago, you had a conversation with Mr. DeVant concerning Mr. Segretti. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. It was never clear to me, even from the conversation with Mr. DeVant, that he was the one that had referred Segretti to me or had given him my name. I was suspicious of that fact. He mentioned that Segretti had contacted him and asked him to paraphrase for somebody that had guts, and apparently he gave him my name.
Now, how long did you work for Mr. Segretti?
Well, I was first contacted by him in, I believe, October, or I think it was October, but I really didn't start, my activities didn't really start until about December, and they ran mostly through until the primary, which I believe was March 14th in Florida. I did participate with him in some activities after that, as late as April or May. But I suppose the entire time I was involved with Mr. Segretti in political sabotage, if you will, would be about 6 months.
Now, during that period of time, you had telephonic and in-person contact with him. Did you discuss with Mr. Segretti his strategy for the Democratic primary in Florida?
Yes, sir. We discussed what we thought were the strategies, what we wanted to do. The idea was that everybody knew Wallace was going to take the state, but that, given that fact, second was as good as first, really, for the rest of the candidates. It would not have been a defeat if Senator Muskie had come in second in Florida, because everybody expected Wallace to take the state. What we wanted to have was for Senator Muskie to come in fourth, fifth, or worse, because this would derail his bandwagon, so to speak, while coming in second would not. And the idea was to not only just confuse the campaigns of the candidates, but to cause divisiveness, to make it difficult for them to unite after the convention. And some of the things that we have done, which I'll go into later, you'll be able to see that clearly.
Now, was there also discussion about Senator Muskie and his personality with Mr. Segretti?
Yes, sir. He mentioned to me that Senator Muskie had a short fuse, and that if enough pressure week by week was put on him and enough things went wrong, that he would be more apt to blow that fuse.
By the way, could you explain to the committee how you communicated telephonically with Mr. Segretti initially?
Well, initially, he called me. He called me station to station. I was living at the time with my parents. I moved to Fort Lauderdale during that time initially when he was contacting me. He also called by phone from California, station to station. It was never a person-to-person call.
Did you use your real name in talking with Mr. Segretti?
Yes.
On the phone? Did there come a time later when you started calling Mr. Segretti and did not use your name?
Exactly. After several months, he gave me a number of an answering service somewhere in the Midwest, Cook and Associates or something to that effect. I would call if I needed to get in touch with him and leave the name Mr. Douglas, and he would call me back. Usually we had a set time. He would call me every 2 weeks on a Monday at 12 o'clock or something of the sort. But if something came up where we had to communicate before that, or I thought I did, I was to call this number and he'd get back in touch with me.
Now, did there come a time when you and Mr. Segretti began to place false advertisements?
Yes.
And can you describe to the committee, first of all, those were in newspapers and on the radio, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And can you describe the substance of those advertisements, what they were aimed at?
Well, there were advertisements placed in the university newspaper, University of Miami campus newspaper. I think one was read yesterday, the one ad. There was also another one in there. There's a Cuban newspaper, local one in Miami, that an ad was placed alluding to Senator Muskie saying that we should start recognizing Cuba and start trying to cooperate and work with them. And I think it ended by him saying that I was born in Maine and I'm a good American, which, of course, was meant to insult the Cubans that read it. A similar ad was put on the radio with the same type of copy. It was read on the Cuban radio station.
And I take it those advertisements were focused primarily on Senator Muskie, is that correct?
Totally, yes, sir. They weren't signed by an individual, but they had a tag on it referring to the Senator Muskie re-election, Senator Muskie for President Committee.
Now, did you also distribute with Mr. Segretti literature on a number of occasions?
Yes, sir.
And can you describe briefly the nature of the literature you were distributing?
Some of the literature were posters that we put up that were shown yesterday, the busing posters. He and I put some of those up in Miami. There was literature distributed for a bogus lunch that was held in Senator Muskie's behalf at his campaign headquarters. These were passed out, telling them to bring the invitation with them, and they would get a free lunch and liquor and get to meet Senator Muskie and his wife. And we also had literature passed out on campus, some passed out on Miami Beach, some at picnics, a couple at his rallies.
On that invitation to a free lunch, did you do anything after passing out? Did you take any further action after passing out those pamphlets?
Yes, sir. Which is really practically the strategy of what we were doing, as kind of illustrated. The morning that the lunch was to take place, of course, the Muskie headquarters people did not know about it. I think we had passed these out the day or 2 days before. I called in the morning representing myself as a distraught Lindsay supporter and mentioned that I wanted to be anonymous, but something had taken place I was very upset about, that had been done by someone from Lindsay's camp, and that they should be expecting some lunch crashers very shortly. The evening before, then I gave him the address of a local Lindsay headquarters where he could go down and check it out.
That call was to Senator Muskie's headquarters, is that correct?
Yes. The evening before, I had taken some of the invitations and had put them in front of the door of the Lindsay headquarters that I gave him the address of, put a rock on it, and knowing that in the morning they would come, pick them up, and bring them inside. Then when the Muskie aides did come to the headquarters, they'd probably find the ads inside the headquarters.
And that, I take it, demonstrates in your description the attempt to divide and leave a residue of some bitterness between the camps. Is that
yes,
correct?
Sir. Which sort of focuses on a misconception that this committee seems to have on one of the purposes of what was done. I know there were some questions yesterday by Senator Ervin and by Senator Gurney about this. These things that were being done weren't done to influence votes necessarily at all. You send out 50, even as bad as they were, I didn't have anything to do with that letter, the sexual letter. As bad as they were, they only went to, I think, 50 people. You're not going to affect a primary by sending 50 letters out. The letters were bad enough that they were expected to be brought to the notice of the candidate that sent them, and for him to, of course, be upset about it, for him to blame possibly another candidate running in the Democratic primary. The idea was to get the candidates backbiting each other and possibly to start doing it to each other outside of our activities. They weren't necessarily to influence votes. If we could get, say, Senator Jackson very, very upset at Senator McGovern for something that was done, after the convention he might raise half the money he would have, speak at half the places he would have in his state. If that would have meant a percentage point or even half a percentage point, it could have meant the difference in the state during the general election.
Now, did you also, with Mr. Segretti, issue false press releases?
Yes, sir.
And again, for the same strategy, I take it?
Yes, sir.
Can you just describe briefly the nature of the releases, what they contained, if you remember them?
I don't remember distinctly. I think one referred to Senator Humphrey. These were written on Muskie stationery. Referred to Senator Muskie's ambiguous stand, or at least the claim in the release, ambiguous stand on aid to Israel, which of course didn't go over very well on Miami Beach. And I can't recall exactly what I think there were 3 releases, maybe 4 that I had sent.
And did that press release contrast Senator Humphrey's position on that issue with Senator Muskie's to make it appear that it was a pamphlet or a flyer handed out by Senator Muskie?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Was there also a press release indicating Senator Muskie favored busing while he sent his children to private schools?
Well, I'm not sure that was a release because I don't think it would be on Senator Muskie's stationery.
That would have been a flyer, I think.
Yes.
By the way, did you ever get any kind of impression or understanding of how successful this strategy was during the primary?
No, not specifically. I didn't have, contrary to what was reported, a spy in any headquarters. I could only perceive that a lot was going on, that they were having problems. I've worked in campaigns and have been in campaign headquarters myself. And if a lot of food all of a sudden started arriving and a lot of weird phone calls and a lot of people walking in for lunches started happening, I know I would certainly be upset about it, and fake press releases, etc. So I only surmise that they were having problems. I didn't have personal knowledge of that.
Now, did there come a time when Mr. Segretti dictated a letter to you over the phone?
Yes, sir. There was a letter that purportedly said that a congressman from the west coast of Florida had donated his aids and some typewriters to Senator Muskie's campaign, which more or less mentions that, or alludes to the fact that he is using paid government workers, his staff members, to work for a presidential primary candidate. And these were sent to, I think one was sent to Jack Anderson, I think one was sent to the Boston Globe, one was sent to Rowan and Martin, what's their name? Evans and Novak. I believe one was sent to night newspapers. I can't recall for sure. And,
I'm sorry, did you send one to Senator Jackson's headquarters also?
Yes, sir, just in case the newsmen weren't doing their job on that. We figured that would work, that they would certainly get back in touch with Senator Muskie and check it out before they printed it. Just in case they didn't, we sent one to Senator Jackson's headquarters because we knew they wouldn't be too happy about it.
And Mr. Beckett, do you have the documents? If you look at tab 9, I believe it is, does that appear to be the letter that you just referred to, Mr. Kelly?
Yes.
And that is on Senator Muskie's stationery, is it
Yes,
not?
sir.
Now, Mr. Kelly, did you also, on occasion, discuss with Mr. Segretti the use of stink bomb or some kind of chemical for use at political events?
Yes, sir. I have a friend that is a chemist, and he came up with a concoction. The name is butyl mercaptan, and he guaranteed me that it would make
You want to get that spelling?
I think it's Butylmercaptan. He guaranteed me that it made rotten egg smell like a rose. It was just horrible, and it was. It was very, very bad stuff. And it wasn't physically harmful, but it was very, very noxious. It was terrible to have to sit there and smell it, and would cause great discomfort for anyone being near it. This was used. Senator Muskie had a picnic scheduled in Miami, and it was so bad, even inside of a bottle you could smell it. We had to put wax around it and put it in a Coke. And the way it was used, the cap was open, a Coke was dropped, and everybody thought the food was bad. So it kind of made the picnic a bad affair. And I think it was, he took some of it and used it up in Tampa, from what I understand.
And it was used at a picnic in the Miami area?
Yes.
Now, did you also conduct other activities on primary day in Florida, March 14th of this year, of 72?
Yes, sir.
And can you describe those to the committee?
On primary day, we had at the campaign headquarters for Senator Muskie, we called, some floral arrangements were brought in, some chicken, some pizzas, I think $300 or $400 worth of liquor. The telephones, we tried to tie up the telephones by, we knew the sequence, or at least the number on his campaign material was 1, 2, 3, 4, say, the last 4 digits. We just took the last digit and kept adding one number to it and calling it until we had all of his phone outlets. And we went to a phone booth. By we, I mean I went to a phone booth, would call the number. When they answered, I'd leave it off the hook, and I'd walk out of the booth and put an out-of-order sign on it. I'm not sure if that worked. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure it didn't work because the phones cut off when this happens. At least I discovered that a week or so later when I tried it on myself. So I don't think it was effective, but we did do that.
Now, was there one occasion when you went to a press conference held by Senator Muskie at a hotel in the Miami area?
Yes, sir.
And can you describe what activities you conducted there?
Well, he had a press conference at the Four Ambassadors Hotel. I went down and asked some Cubans to hold up some signs saying, "Muskie, go home. We want a free Cuba." And they were picketing in front of the press conference, which got some of the press's attention. I also walked into the press conference with a long overcoat and dropped 2 white mice with blue ribbons on their tails saying, "Muskie is a rat fink." And I also let a small finch out, which was flying around the room and causing some commotion. And it sort of made Senator Muskie's press conference comical at the time.
I didn't hear, Mr. Kelly. Did you describe what instructions the pickets had?
The pickets, I don't remember clearly, something to the effect, "Muskie, go home. We want a free Cuba." In other words, to make it look like the Cubans were unhappy with Senator Muskie. I gave them Humphrey buttons to wear. They were all wearing Humphrey buttons, which I tried to stage. When one of Senator Muskie's aides came up and asked about it, I told him confidentially that we were really working for Senator Jackson.
By the way, were you receiving Senator Muskie's schedule from Mr. Segretti for his activities in Florida on occasion?
I was receiving it orally. I never had a written report of it. He would call me and give me sometimes as much as a week's notice of his activities. I think he had a ticket, a train stop through the state, that a whistle-stop tour he referred to it as. I think I had a week's notice on that, although I didn't do anything on that particular issue. Other times I'd have maybe 1 day's notice of a schedule. For instance, he may be talking to the staff of a newspaper the next day. If this was the case, I would call up in the morning and either cancel the appointment or move it up an hour or back an hour, which would cause disconcertment amongst both the press and the candidate.
Now, on occasion, did you On one occasion, were you asked by Mr. Segretti to come to Washington, D.C.?
Yes, sir.
And was that to attempt to disrupt Senator Muskie's campaign dinner here?
Yes, sir. He called me very short notice, Thursday or Friday. I flew up on a Saturday morning. The dinner was to be held Monday night at the Washington Hilton. And we tried to organize a rally of demonstrators. We printed up some signs, leaflets, saying to come demonstrate against the fat cats, $1,000 reception and a $500 plate dinner or something of that sort. And we made up some signs for the demonstrators. None showed, but we did that. We contacted...
Did you call any groups in the Washington area to come to that demonstration?
Yes, we use the underground newspaper, whatever it's called.
Well, I think it's been referred to here before. I think it's the Quicksilver Times.
All right, Quicksilver Times. And there's a section in the newspaper that shows all the different groups, the Black Panthers, the Gay Liberation Front, all the weird different groups they have. And we called them, different organizations. I don't mean to say all the weird groups. They had different organizations listed too. And we called them, contacted them, told them about the rally, when it was, when to be there. I think we called some people from the Hare Krishna movement, and they said they would certainly have their heads shaved and have their drums out there ready to go, but they didn't show up either. We contacted perhaps 10 or 12 African diplomats and told them that they were speaking in behalf of Muskie. I represented myself as a Muskie aide. I called them by phone, invited them to the dinner for Monday night, told them to wear their native garb. And then we called the limousine services and had a limousine pick each one of them up and bring them to the Washington Hilton, which was regretful, but the result of it was embarrassing for Senator Muskie, embarrassing for the diplomats, and of course the chauffeurs were less than happy about it also.
Now, when you had the leaflets printed up on that occasion, did you try to implicate Senator Humphrey's campaign in that?
Yes, we had them printed up at a local, it was a Georgetown print shop. By we, I mean myself and Segretti, set the type to it and did it there and had it run off there and acted like it was going to be a great big affair. Then we left the address on the bill of the Humphrey headquarters in town. And also, I think we left the name of George Kennedy, who was, I believe, his Northeastern campaign manager or something of that sort. Figuring that the owner of the printing shop would be alarmed, would call the authorities to try to give them some warning if there was not a network indeed anyway, set up for that, and that they would check out who had ordered and made up the leaflets, and of course it would check back to Humphrey headquarters.
Now, did you also talk with Mr. Segretti about activities that might be pursued during the Democratic National Convention in Miami?
Yes, we didn't go into a lot of detail about it. We were supposed to, or we were going to, set a time aside, maybe in July, to get together and to go over details on it. That never happened because of the Watergate break-in and the heat of the investigation. We discussed getting possibly advanced lists of the delegate count of the delegations for each state at the convention. When they're calling the delegation chairman, setting up an appointment for the candidate to meet the delegation, representing ourselves from that candidate's camp, and of course he would not show up, which would get the delegation unhappy. In that manner, we were hoping to probably do that with everyone except McGovern, since he was the desirable nominee of the convention as far as we were concerned. Also, this has been gone over several times, and I'm not sure it's actually a fact. There was supposed to be a flyover by an airplane trailing pot, promiscuity, whatever, peace, vote McGovern. This was ordered in about April or May, maybe June, I think about May. I'm not even positive if I left some money for it at one of the local skywriter firms or whatever they are. I don't recall distinctly if I even left money there, but I know I never contacted them again. I never personally saw the plane trailing this message. Someone told me they had seen a plane with some sort of a weird message. I told that to Mr. Segretti, and apparently he thought it sort of exaggerated itself along the way. It may have happened, but I have no personal knowledge of that.
Mr. Kelly, did you rent some hotel rooms at Mr. Segretti's request
Yes, sir.
for the convention?
Rented, put some deposits down on them, I believe in May again. The purpose is hazy. He didn't go into any detail on it. He mentioned that there may be some people coming down, long hairs, hippies possibly, that may demonstrate in front of the Doral Hotel.
Now, during this period of time, and with reference to your activities for Mr. Segretti, did you obtain in your possession certain records that reflected these activities?
Could you repeat that, please?
Did you have documents that you used or obtained during this period of time that would have reflected your activities for Mr. Segretti?
Yes, I had copies of different flyers and different ideas and notes and phone numbers that I did have in my possession.
What did you do with those documents?
Well, I destroyed them. This is about September, I suppose, or October of '72, when this started coming out into the open. I was getting calls from investigators, and I was, of course, upset about it. I wanted to, frankly, destroy what evidence there was of my involvement, so I just took it out and threw it away.
Do you recall which investigative agency was the first to contact you?
The Senator Kennedy's subcommittee on administrative practices and government administrative practices and procedures subcommittee, I think is the title. I'm not sure.
Do you have any recollection of when you first were contacted either by the FBI or the U.S. Attorney's Office in Florida?
Yes, I think I was contacted by the FBI in August. In late August, I was contacted on one occasion. This subcommittee contacted me, I believe, in about October.
Thank you very much. I have no questions.
Mr. Chairman, before you pass the questioning to minority counsel, I'd like to introduce Mr. Howard Liebengood, who will question the witness today, and also to announce, if I may, that I'm the senior Republican, the ranking Republican on the Public Works Committee, which is having an executive session at 11 o'clock. And with the chairman of the committee's permission, I'd like to absent myself from the hearings in order to attend that executive session.
Well, those things on the board, but I'd also like to state this time that Senator Talmadge is having to attend a very important meeting of the Finance Committee. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kelly, was your involvement in politics prior to your contact with Donald Segretti conducted at the collegiate level?
Yes, sir, mostly.
And had you ever held a salaried position in any Republican campaign?
Not salaried. I had a position that I had expenses paid on several occasions.
And what position was that?
Well, I was, in 1970, I was working for Governor Kirk's reelection. In 1968, I was involved in students for Nixon on campus and some local elections. There was a man running for Congress and for state Senate that I was involved in.
Were there any political pranks involved in that campaign with regard to your job position?
Well, there were political pranks pulled, yes, sir. There were, I don't think there's been a campaign I've ever seen where there haven't been some political pranks. Not to this scope, no, but there were some pranks pulled.
And were these pranks, to your experience, pulled by both sides of the campaigns?
Yes, sir.
By people working for the campaigns?
Yes, sir.
You were a student. Were you a student at the time that you participated in the activities with Mr. Segretti?
Yes, sir.
You indicated in your opening statement that you were initially paid a modest salary and that you were to be paid $700 a month.
Yes.
Is it my understanding correct that you were never paid $700 a month?
I believe I was to start in June with $700 a month. In May, I moved into an apartment in Fort Lauderdale, and I received an advance, I think, of $400 or $500 that was to be taken from prorated the next 3 months. I think I was to receive $500 a month for June, July, August. As it turned out, I did not receive anything after that time.
Did you continue with the same modest salary that you started with throughout
No,
your
sir.
contact?
No, sir.
What was that salary? $150 a month?
Yes, sir.
And that was all you ever received?
No, I received money for expenses.
In
That
terms
was
of
salary.
salary, yeah.
That was salary.
Now, when Mr. Segretti contacted you with regard to negative campaigning, you indicated that you expressed some interest in that when he said it. Did you have any hesitation at all about participating in his activities?
Well, if you're talking about the initial contact, I wasn't exactly aware of what his activities were going to be, number one. Number two, I did have some misgivings about taking part in it. I wasn't sure what I was getting into. It was more of a gradual thing. I guess I just kept digging a bigger and bigger hole for myself.
But do I understand correctly that you did this of your own volition?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Segretti did not persuade you with political favors, offers of political favors, or
No, he
anything
did
like
not.
that?
No, he did not.
At any time?
No, he did not.
Did Mr. Segretti ever tell you that he was employed by the CRP, the Republican National Committee, or working for anyone in higher authority?
No, sir. Although he knew I didn't believe that he came from a wealthy family, whenever I asked him about who he was working for, who he was working with, where he was getting his money, naturally I was curious about it, he would reply, "I don't know," which, of course, he was putting me off. He told me that after the election, we would sit down and have a nice cold beer, and he'd tell me the whole situation and maybe meet the boys, is the way it was put.
Now, this variety of political pranks that were pulled, were these all Mr. Segretti's ideas?
No. Some of them were mine. A minority of the amount, several were, let me put it that way, were my ideas. But mostly I was working on his direction. There were some things that were done that I did on my own that I thought of and did.
Do you know how much thought or planning went into the preparation of these ideas?
Well, it varied. Usually there wasn't a lot of preparation. Often we would think up something over the phone, or on the occasions I met with him in Miami, we would talk about them and come up with something and maybe do it next week or the next day or something. It was never a schedule. 5 weeks and 3 days from now we do this, and 6 weeks we do this. If I want to contradict one thing. I do believe we had a schedule, but we never followed it, and it was very general. It was a calendar we made up, and it was useless.
Now, I understand that there was one instance, as testified to yesterday by Mr. Segretti and alluded to this morning, where the source of the materials that you distributed did not originate with you or Mr. Segretti.
Yes, sir. There was an occasion of that.
I'm referring to the flyer regarding Senator McGovern's real record on the war.
Yes, sir.
Ostensibly prepared by Students for Honesty in Government. Would you describe to the committee how you came into possession of that document in some detail?
Well, yes, sir. That document at the University of Miami is where I got the document. The Democratic organization on campus was divided into several groups that were for different candidates, Democratic presidential candidates. The group that had the Muskie table set up had this information on the table. That's where I got it from.
And the Students for Honesty in Government, was that a name that you put on the pamphlet, or was that a name that was on there?
No, sir, that was a name that was on there. My guess is that the Muskie organization didn't want to have their tag on it, but nevertheless, it was on their table. It may not have been printed by them, but they were distributing it. And it more or less went into contradictions of Senator McGovern's voting record and what he may have said, I recall.
Did you ever take part in infiltrating any campaign?
No.
Did you ever take part in any act of violence in the campaign?
No, sir.
Do you know whether or not
Not
any
physical.
of your political pranks that you've described resulted in violence?
Not in violence, no.
You've testified this morning that on March 14th, the day of the Florida primary, you sent pizzas to a headquarters, flowers.
Yes, sir.
Previously, you had used stink bombs.
Yes, sir.
Now, do you seriously think that any of these activities had any impact on the outcome of the Florida primary?
Yes.
In what way?
Well, on the Florida primary itself, possibly not. It certainly had an effect on the candidates. It certainly didn't help Senator Muskie.
My understanding is that it was not your intent or purpose to influence the public vote by your activities.
That's right.
But rather to create agitation among the respective Democratic candidates. Is that correct?
That's true. Indirectly, this could be attributed to having some effect on the vote, very slight, only in the fact that if the candidate gets irritated, it might cause him to be less than casual when he's before a group. I'm referring, of course, to like New Hampshire when Senator Muskie was crying in front of the Boston Globe.
There's also been some indication that you promoted certain demonstrations. Is it your impression that these demonstrations also have some effect on the vote as well as agitate the candidate? Not necessarily your demonstrations, but demonstrations in general.
I'm not convinced they had a direct effect on the vote. As far as a demonstration is concerned, they're kind of commonplace now, especially during presidential election times. But the purpose of it was, if Senator Muskie or another candidate was speaking somewhere, signs would be placed in a position where the press could pick them up. It reduces more or less the pedestal effect of the candidate standing there by himself without any indication of other candidates around. When you have other posters around of the other candidates, he looks more like one of them, or it's sort of a psychological thing.
What were your misgivings at the time that you took part in these activities?
My misgivings? Well, it'd be nice to say I was regretting it. I wasn't, jumping for joy about it. I'm not sure I realized exactly what I was doing. When I was doing it, especially when the investigating started, I was more scared than anything else. And then after that, when I practically became immune to the pressure of the investigators and the press calling constantly, I had more time to reflect about just what in the heck I was doing. And I really can't say that at the time I regretted it. Otherwise, I imagine I wouldn't have been doing it.
At the time you were conducting these activities, did you feel that you were participating in a type of activity that was part and parcel of the American political system?
No.
You did not feel that way then?
I didn't feel that it was part and parcel of the American system, no. I realized what I was involved with. What I was involved in was a much deeper scope of, for lack of a better term, sabotage than possibly had been done earlier. I have no personal knowledge of that. But I can only say that from what I had seen in other campaigns and previous activities I had taken part in, that the pranks and the silly things that are done were not to this, were not of this scope. That's the only way I can really place it. I can't put it in a category.
And I trust you still feel the same way today, if not more so, that there's no place in the system for this type of activity.
Absolutely not.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Chairman,
Thank you.
Senator Allaway.
Mr. Kelly, watching you this morning, I can't help but gather the impression that you were rather pleased or proud with your apparent successes in political sabotage. Is my conclusion correct, sir?
Your conclusion is very ridiculous. Possibly I'm getting a demeanor of confidence, or maybe I act like I was happy with it. That's not the case. I very much regret it. I feel the damage, the personal damage and the mental misgivings are secondary to the guilt I feel for the senators and the people that I may have hurt personally or
When did you
politically.
begin to feel this regret, sir?
I began feeling the regrets when I started realizing, not necessarily when I was caught or was brought into it. I started feeling this, I suppose, about the time I stopped doing it. August, September, October, November. It was something that I had time to stop. When I wasn't doing it, I had time to stop and think about it a little bit. I attribute it to being politically immature. I guess ambition's like many things. Too much of it's bad, and I'm afraid I was overambitious and frankly was expecting to have high contacts. I wasn't sure exactly who I was working with, but I had an idea it was maybe from the White House or the Re-election Committee. And my ideas of short-term success, I'm afraid, were very, very unfortunate. If we had gotten away with it, Senator, and I had not been caught, I assure you I would feel at least as guilty.
I gather from your responses this morning that you were not aware of Mr. Segretti's real identity until after the election?
Yes, sir. I didn't find out what his real identity was until I read it in the newspaper.
And yet you were willing to follow his advice and involve yourself in criminal activities, someone unknown to you?
Well, it wasn't necessarily him just using me. I kind of had felt of myself as possibly not just as a tool, but maybe using him. I was thinking of after the election of maybe a job in Washington. I'm not rationalizing or condoning my actions at all. Any shame or abuse that can be heaped on me is certainly well deserved, but it's not something that's going to make any difference. I feel guilty now as I have 2 weeks ago, or I will 2 weeks from now.
Were you ever concerned about the legality of your activities?
Yes, sir.
And still you persisted?
Yes, sir. It began with pranks. It started getting more and more intense. I was aware that some of the things that I was doing were not legal. I'd be lying if I told you otherwise. I knew some of them were illegal. I was just like I was weaving my own spider web. I couldn't get out of it. I was in a hole too deep. I should have. It's easy now for me to look back and say, gosh, why didn't I just say, forget it, don't bother me anymore. But as I said earlier, I can only attribute it to being immature, to being overly ambitious. And I've asked myself 1,000 times, why did I do it?
As a once promising young political leader, and looking back in retrospect, I'd like to list several of your activities, and if you would be so kind as to tell this committee whether you consider these activities unethical, immoral, or illegal. False advertising.
Illegal. Unethical. You can say all three of them to that.
Distribution of misleading literature without identifying the source.
Or identifying an incorrect source, I think you could add. I would say all three again.
Fake invitations to non-existing events.
Same.
Fake press releases.
Same.
False and untrue letters designed to injure the candidate of the opposition party.
Same three.
Stink bombs.
Foolish, same thing.
Forcibly entering into a headquarters.
I did never do that.
Senator, what are you referring to in that regard?
Mr. Segretti suggested that they forcibly opened the window to drop a stink bomb into the
I don't think he was referring to me in that
I don't
problem.
believe Mr. Kelly was involved in that at all. I was in
I'm
Tampa,
sorry,
Florida.
sir. Ordering materials, supplies, food, beverages, limousines in behalf of an opposition candidate with no intention to pay for this.
Same.
Inviting ambassadors of foreign countries.
Same.
Do you believe there is something inherently wrong in engaging in activities for which the real perpetrator seeks to avoid responsibility?
Yes.
Is there something wrong which interferes with each party not being able to select freely their best candidates?
Yes, sir. I believe that's true.
Is it now your conclusion that in Florida, the people of Florida were not given the right to freely select their best candidate?
I think that's kind of a sweeping generality to say that most people were not because of my activities. I think most people were very much unaware of the activities that were taking place. The candidates themselves were. There were not that many votes affected. However, I agree with you that even if one person was affected by it adversely, that it was wrong. They should have had a free choice decision.
I thank you very much, sir.
Yes, sir.
Senator Gurney.
Mr. Kelly, let's go to this distribution of literature, which you made. I notice here in the witness summary, item 2 is distribution of misleading literature. Would you give us an idea of how much literature you distributed down in Florida?
Well, you mean...
Let's take some examples.
Oh, okay.
And what I'm trying to find out is whether this, I don't know how to characterize this operation. I think I used the word rinky-dink yesterday, and I think that's really what it was. What I'm trying to find out is, did it really have any effect upon this election? So what kind of distribution did you make?
Well, Senator Gurney, before I answer that specific question, I want you to understand that the literature that was distributed wasn't necessarily distributed to influence the amount of votes in an election. The person receiving it wasn't, even if 50 of these were passed out, 50 are not going to affect the election.
I agree.
What we were doing was that we were expecting at least one of those 50 to be enraged enough to show that to the candidate to become upset about it. If it was blamed on another candidate in the primary election, to cause discord, malcontent. And it wasn't necessarily the direct effect on the vote, it was the effect on the candidates that we were interested in.
I might comment on that. I think every one of the 100 senators who serve in the United States Senate has had all kinds of dirty tricks played on him in the course of political campaigns, and we expect it. I'm not so sure how much it upsets us. I could give you examples in my own campaign that are far more horrendous than some of these here. It worked against me that you don't really pay much attention to it because you expect some of these things. But anyway, how much distribution did you make? And incidentally, I'm not minimizing this dirty trick business. I loathe it. But it is a part of politics. It's a part of both sides of politics. All of us in politics know and expect some of these things by some of the fringe elements. I hope that our deliberations here perhaps will produce legislation and laws that will be better able to control this. But back again, what about the distribution now? Give us some examples of how widespread you distributed some of these things.
Well, it wasn't. All right, I'll give you some examples. The University of Miami, there was a flyer that was put around campus. Former Secretary of the Interior Udall was supposed to speak in behalf, I believe, of the Young Democrats on campus. They decided to cancel his engagement there because they felt he was maybe less than an effective speaker. We found out about it. We put up flyers all over campus announcing the time and place they had previously set and canceled for Secretary Udall to be speaking. So they had to put him back on the schedule, from what I understand, and also from what I understand, it didn't go over very well, his speech.
Who was he speaking for?
Well, he was being hosted by the Young Democrats. He was speaking to the student body.
I mean, was he speaking on behalf of one of the candidates?
Yes, sir. I believe he was speaking on behalf of Senator Muskie.
So in this event, you may have helped Senator Muskie by making sure that Secretary Udall appeared. Is that right?
Well, if I'm to believe the reports from Muskie's staff that he's not that effective a speaker, I'm not sure.
Give us some other examples.
There were some leaflets passed out on Miami Beach that were I'm not completely clear on it. I think they were supposedly to be from Lindsay, knocking Muskie's stance, or Humphrey's, I'm not sure which, on his stance for Israel, how he feels that Israel should be treated the same way as Cuba, our relations to Cuba. These were passed out and put under the windshield wipers of cars parked at the synagogues.
How many?
Maybe 100, 200. There were flyers.
Do you think this had much effect on the election?
Well, again, sir, I can't, of course, put a statistic on what it did in terms of votes. I'm sure it's very small, but again, I refer that the purpose was not to affect votes in the Florida primary. It was to cause malcontent, discomfort among the candidates, to get them backbiting, and to make them feel that they were sabotaging each other.
I noticed you mentioned that in some of your work you thought you may have hurt Senator Muskie, but I see here one of the fake press releases says that, or said that Hubert Humphrey had not supported as much military assistance for Israel as Senator Muskie. Now, I know something about Florida politics. If that went out, that would do nothing except help Senator Muskie vis-a-vis Senator Humphrey. Because that was the one big issue, of course, among the Jewish population in Dade County, which is very considerable, still is today.
I don't have that in front of me. I can't recall exactly what you mean by it. I can assure you, if we put it out, it wasn't for the benefit of Senator Muskie.
See, there's one notation here that you helped distribute the reprint of a Newsweek article about Mrs. Muskie.
Yes, sir.
I won't go into the article. It's here in the exhibits, but I'll summarize it by saying it was a pretty good hatchet job on Mrs. Muskie, wasn't it?
Yes, sir. It was written by Newsweek.
And how many of those did you put out?
Well, they were reprinted. They were passed out, I believe, at Senator Muskie's picnic that he had down there. The same one that had the stink bomb, for lack of a better phrase. And
how many would you say?
A couple of hundred.
Well, I might point out that Newsweek, which is owned by the Washington Post, has a circulation of 2,725,000. I think they probably did a much better job than you did.
Well,
doing a hatchet job on Mrs. Muskie.
That would have been worked as a complementary thing to what we were doing then.
I must say I've read it, and I don't think much of it either. I don't know why they printed it. You worked in Florida exclusively, except the trip to Washington, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Did any people work with you?
Only people that I would hire. I refrained from using friends or political associates for the reason that I wasn't overly proud of what I was doing, even though I did not quit. I wanted to keep it a secret. My parents didn't even know about it when I was living at home.
How many?
For several reasons. If I was to be caught, they wouldn't be drug into it also.
How many were engaged in your operation? Now, how many people did you hire to help you?
Well, I never had anyone full-time. At different times, I would say a couple of groups, 20.
These were the people, I suppose, that handed out leaflets and things like that?
Yes, sir. I'd say between 20 and 30.
So you're familiar probably with the political campaign as a whole in Florida, are you not? I mean, you had some idea of what went on because of your interest in politics.
Yes, sir.
Isn't it true that there were thousands of young people in Florida on the Republican side, and also on the Democrat side for that matter, who were working hard in legitimate ways for the re-election of President Nixon and also the candidacy of Senator McGovern? Isn't that a fact?
There were indeed, sir.
I don't have any other questions, Mr. Chairman.
In a moment, Senator Ervin will press Mr. Kelly about whether his activities influenced any votes in the Florida primary. Right now, we're going to take a short pause. Public television coverage of the Senate Watergate hearings will continue after this break for station identification.
Unabridged coverage of the hearings is being broadcast as a public service by your local public television station. This is PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service. NPAC continues its coverage of hearings by the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. Here again, NPAC correspondent Jim Lehrer.
As we go back to the hearing room, Senator Ervin wants to know about those anti-Muskie radio spots in Miami.
You say that you didn't intend to influence votes?
Well, if that happened also, then we didn't try to stop it. If some votes were influenced, that's fine too, but that wasn't the main purpose.
Well, now, the truth is that Mr. Segretti told you that the polls showed that Senator Muskie was running ahead of President Kennedy, didn't he?
President Kennedy?
I mean President Nixon.
I don't believe so, no.
Well, he told you that the polls showed that Muskie was the Democrat who had the best chance to beat President Nixon, and therefore it was the policy of those in charge of the campaign to try to knock out Muskie as a candidate.
Yes, sir.
Yes. And there is a presumption of law and a presumption of common sense and a presumption of logic that a man intends to be presumed to intend the natural consequences of his acts. Now, you put a radio advertisement in the Miami radio, didn't you?
Yes, sir.
What size city is Miami?
Well, the city itself, I suppose, has a million people.
Yes. And thousands and thousands of them are of Cuban ancestry, aren't they?
Yes, sir.
And many of those Cubans had become naturalized American citizens that were eligible to vote in the primary.
Yes, sir.
How often did you run this radio advertisement in which you stated that Muskie was in favor of Castro?
I think it was run 1 or 2 times.
And you can't tell us how many of the hundreds of thousands of people, a million people in the Miami area heard that, can you?
How many Cubans did you say?
No, yeah, people.
People? Well,
yeah.
Not many outside of the Cubans because it was a Spanish radio station.
Well, Castro was, and Cuban communism was one of the most unpopular men and one of the most unpopular issues in Cuba, in Florida, wasn't it?
Yes, sir.
And you tell me you didn't intend to influence any Cubans or voting Cubans or their sympathizers in sending this, having this radio broadcast of the false statement that Muskie was in favor of recognizing Castro and communist Cuba?
No, sir, I didn't say that. I said that wasn't the main purpose. If some votes were influenced, that's fine. And I might add, sir, that an overwhelming majority of Cubans are not Democrats. They couldn't vote in the Democratic primary. About, I'd say, 80% are Republican. So it wasn't necessarily to influence votes in the Democratic primary. It was to get the Cubans upset at Muskie.
I have found out in many states that many people register in the name of a party. Do you ever examine the registration books, show how many thousands of Cubans were registered to vote in the Democratic primary?
Yes, sir.
How many?
I believe in the Democratic primary, see if I can put an exact number on it. I think it was 14,000. I'm not exactly sure. I think there's about 35 or 40,000 Republicans.
Yeah.
That's off. I'm not. That may not.
And
be
all
true.
of them have sympathizers, don't they?
Have sympathizers?
Yes, people that sympathize with their plight and are strongly opposed to the recognition of Castro.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Well, that's what you did for the Cubans. Now you know that there's been a great deal of controversy, and one of the most sensitive issues in the state of Florida for several years has been the involuntary busing of school children to integrate schools.
Yes, sir.
And you knew that a large part of the white population of Florida was opposed to busing.
Yes, sir.
So you falsely pictured that Muskie wanted to have more busing instead of less, didn't you?
Yes, sir.
Yes. And don't you think that had a natural tendency to affect Muskie's chances among people who were opposed to busing?
Well, it certainly didn't help his chances, but I would venture to say the other Democrats running didn't have much of a different stance except for Wallace.
But you didn't advertise them, did you?
Oh, I think they were.
Just Muskie.
I think we did. I think Senator McGovern, another part of the state, was advertised for doing that.
Now, that's what you did for the white population.
Okay.
Then Miami has a tremendous Jewish population, doesn't it?
Yes, sir.
One of the largest Jewish populations of any country, any city in this country, doesn't it?
Yes, sir.
And you put in advertisements in the newspapers in Miami that rather you distributed what you call a yellow flag under the false pretense had been written by another Democratic candidate, Lindsay, in which he charged that Muskie was opposed to the aims of Israel, didn't you?
Yes, sir.
So we have, from your own admission there, you were aiming at Cuban voters, you were aiming at the white voters, you were aiming at the Jewish voters to influence them against the Muskie. Now you also engaged in the like advertisements to influence the black vote, didn't you?
What was that again, sir?
You also made advertisements to influence the black vote in Florida, which is considerable, isn't it?
I'm not sure if
Well,
exactly.
didn't you distribute all as far as you could, and you had the assistance of 20 other people doing it? The statement that Muskie didn't thought the time hadn't come to have a black candidate for vice president?
I think that was in Tampa.
Senator, I believe you are confusing Mr. Ben's activities with Mr. Kelly.
That may have been done. I may have done that. I don't recall it.
Well, Mr. Benz was operating in conjunction with you and Mrs. Grady, wasn't he?
Unbeknownst to me, yes, sir.
Yes. And then you went after the liberals to influence them against Muskie by disseminating this document, which has been offered in evidence, called Citizens for a Liberal Alternative.
I'm not positive that I was involved with that either. That's very unclear. I think I had mentioned to
Well, you're
Mr.
positive you're not.
Linsner. No, I'm not positive I'm not.
A synopsis made by the staff, allegedly on the basis of your information to them, states that, as I understand it, that you did distribute that document.
Senator, we went over that last night, and Mr. Kelly was not sure that I think the document was familiar to him, but he couldn't recall whether he had distributed that document or not.
And then you tried to appeal to the conservative state people of Florida to be against Muskie by hiring a naked woman to run in front of his headquarters yelling, "I love Muskie," didn't you?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, that's true.
We've heard a lot in these investigations about cover-up opportunities, activities. I think that might be the first uncovered. And then you not only made attacks on Muskie, but you deliberately distributed the hatchet job which Newsweek had done on Mrs. Muskie.
Yes, sir.
And you still stayed on your oath that you didn't do any of these things for the purpose of influencing the votes of anybody?
I can easily illustrate that to you again if you like. You're talking about influencing the Jewish vote. We might have passed out 50 of them. You realize how many Jewish voters there are on Miami Beach.
Well,
you're referring to the Cuban vote, a small percentage of which voted in the Democratic primary. As far as the white people on the busing issue, I think if you look back, the candidates themselves were, especially Wallace, was using that issue far more than we were, in referring to his busing stand. I'm not denying that some votes may have been influenced very directly by what these were done.
Well,
Senator Ervin, the purpose, almost the complete purpose of this was for when you pass out 40 or 50 or 100 flyers in a Jewish Miami Beach where there's thousands of Jewish voters, you're not intending to sway 50 or 100, 200 votes. You're trying to get that back to the candidate, have them irate about it, have the candidate become upset, and to take action, maybe do something back to the other candidate. But its inherent purpose is to upset the candidate and to try to cause confusion.
You sure did that, didn't you? And
yes, sir.
As a result of activities on your part and others in the Florida primary, the front runner of the Democrats, Senator Muskie, was knocked out. His candidacy was virtually destroyed, wasn't it?
Well, I wouldn't say solely from this. I don't think it certainly didn't help.
Well,
him
by contributing, no, you contributed
Yes,
to
sir.
that, and Mr. Segretti contributed to it, and Mr. Benson contributed to it.
Yes, sir.
And you received money which came from, ultimately from the President's personal attorney for your activities, didn't you?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Now, in addition to these things, first, you go to college?
No, sir. Not now.
Well, have you gone to college?
Yes, sir.
You ever read Shakespeare?
Not as thoroughly as some, sir.
Well, did you ever come into this passage in Shakespeare? Good name in man and woman, dear my lord, is the immediate jewel of their souls. Who steals my purse steals trash. 'Tis something, nothing. 'Twas mine, 'tis his, and has been the slave to thousands. But he that filches from me my good name robs me of that which not enriches him, but makes me poor indeed. Now, don't you think that you engaged in activities which were calculated to rob Senator Muskie and Mrs. Muskie and others of their good names among the voters of Florida?
Yes, sir. I might add that I am not here, sir, defending my position. I don't have a position to defend. I regret very much what was done. I was simply trying to explain to you what our purpose was.
And in addition to spreading false statements, making false advertisements, you also disseminated forged press releases on the letterhead of Muskie's campaign.
I never signed anything, but there were tags
But
saying
you
that there was
distributed them.
Yep. No, sir. I never distributed anything with a forged name.
I didn't say
just-
that. I forged paper.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. And you consider this, I started to say it rises above, but I say it descends below the level of pranks, don't you?
I feel that way without any question. If I may add one thing, I mentioned to Mr. Linsner that, of course, it's easy when you're before a committee or you're interrogated by grand juries to say, gosh, I'm sorry I did it, I really feel regretful. I know you're not going to expect someone up here to say, I did it, great, I'd do it again. I understand that. You can't completely convince somebody that you do feel guilty or bad about these things. It's 2 years ago, but I still feel very bad. I told Mr. Linsner that I very much would like to, since I have firsthand knowledge, I was participating in these acts, to write to him with a report of what I feel could be done to help legislate to possibly make what now are pranks, misdemeanors, are punishable by law. And I will do that.
Well, there's another poet says that a moving finger writes and having writ moves on. Now all your pride in a wish, you wrote back to cancel half a line, and all your tears wash out a word of it, which is very unfortunate because I think you are contrite for what you did, but I'd like to know why you did it, because you knew it was wrong. You look like a person that's had a good opportunity in life and comes from a good home. And you look like a very alert young fellow.
Well, I appreciate that, sir. As to why I did it, I mentioned earlier, I've asked that question to myself 1,000 times. I regret it. It was stupid. As said, I was overly ambitious. I expected temporary success, and as said, even if I had, I couldn't have had a conscience if I didn't feel guilty, even if I was sitting up here with any position. I'd always look back and realize how I got it, who I was working with, and if I could continue on under those circumstances, I wouldn't deserve to be on earth.
Well, I would have to pay you the compliment of saying that you are entitled to the blessed of the Scripture, where it says that blessed is he who sweareth to his own hurt and changeth not. You have made a very frank statement to the committee, and you are to be commended for that.
Thank you, sir.
Senator Weichel.
I have no questions, Mr. Chairman. I think that Mr. Kelly's statement, that it's easy to say I'm sorry when you're before a committee or a grand jury. It's not easy. I don't think it's been easy for you. And quite frankly, not everybody that's appeared before this committee or those that haven't appeared before this committee have said, I'm sorry. Some of them actually have tried to sell it as legitimate or justified by the fact that these things went on in the past. I find neither of those attitudes on your part, and I just want to commend you for your very frank statement.
I appreciate that.
Mr. Kelly, would you please go into a little more detail as to what motivated you to go into this kind of activity and to do the very things that you did and about which you have testified? Give us a better insight into that.
Well, sir, at the outset, I wasn't, if I knew what the scope was at the outset, I'm sure I'd have been frightened away. I would not have wanted to take place. It became more and more apparent to me as I worked with Mr. Segretti that he had a large, he had access to a lot of money. I perceived, although he never told me, that he was probably working with, people in the administration, I guess the White House. I could have been the re-elect the President Committee. My political outlook was frankly immature in that I was expecting the old adverb to get something for, not nothing in this case, something for doing bad. I realized when I first got into it that it was wrong. I wasn't sure that it was going to be the scope that it was. It just got to a point where a little bit more was done, a little bit more was done. Things that were fringing around the law were done. Pranks, putting other candidates' bumper stickers on other candidates' posters that are up instead of tearing them down. Stink bombs, things of this sort. And some of them were frankly comical. At the time I thought some of them were comical. And some of them I enjoyed. Most of them I did not.
But you realized right along that they were bad.
Yes, sir. I knew it was a dirty campaign.
You kept trying to make them worse.
Well, I don't think it was a level like each one was worse than the other. There were different things that were done at different times. I do know that later on, the more illegal things that were done, for instance, the Washington Hilton affair with Senator Muskie's fundraising dinner, that was in April. Those were one of the last things I had done. I'm convinced I wouldn't have done that at the beginning. If I had just come into it, I'm sure I wouldn't have done it. But it was a gradual thing. I'm not saying it would have gone to the point where if he asked me to kill somebody, this is hypothetical. If he asked me to do something of that sort, or anybody did, that I would do it. I would not have. I would never have personally injured anyone. I was never asked to.
Well, I noticed.
But it did get to an extreme part as far as personally damaging the character of people and their political career, possibly.
Well, I noticed that towards the last you were planning on parading a nude woman past Muskie headquarters, and she was supposed to shout, "Muskie, I love you."
Well, that's not exactly the case. What it was is there was a girl that was hungry for money. She needed some money, so I told her that I didn't know her. She was going to Gainesville, where the University of Florida is. I was told Senator Muskie was there. I gave her $20 or $10, I don't remember how much, and asked her if I gave this to her, if she'd be willing to take off her clothes and run in front of his hotel, screaming, "I love you," which she did, unfortunately, but she did. And
you must have known her very well.
Again, unfortunately, no.
How did you have so much confidence to ask her to do this?
Well, I knew it was more of a money thing as far as she was concerned. I certainly wouldn't approach somebody I shouldn't say off the street, on campus, and offer to pay them $20 a strip and run in front of someone's hotel, particularly around it. So I was very surprised that she did this. I didn't expect it to happen, but it was just something that did happen.
Now,
Did you also send some letters out to some of the headquarters without stamps?
No, sir.
Do you know of any of the others who did?
Well, as far as others is concerned, I knew of no one else involved with Mr. Segretti. I know that I personally did not do anything of that sort.
Were you aware of any pranks practiced by the Democratic candidates or their people?
Nothing out of the ordinary. They were ripping down each other's signs, which is something that practically every campaign that's ever taken place has happened, whether the candidate knows it or not.
Anything as serious as what you were doing?
No, sir.
Now, don't you feel that because of what you did, that you have really lost your dignity and decency as a man?
No. If I didn't regret it, I feel I would. I'm not ready to shoot myself, if that's what you mean.
Do you think that regret restores a man's dignity and decency?
I think it's a start.
Well, then you are starting on that.
Well, sir, I'm trying.
All right, now, did you feel at any time, since speaking to Mr. Segretti about this, and planning and so forth, that you were representing either the committee to re-elect the president or the people in the White House, or both?
Did you ask me if I felt that, or if I was told if I felt that? Yes, sir, I felt that.
And did Mr. Segretti indicate to you in any way that you were really working for these people?
No, sir, he never did.
What made you have this feeling of participation with these people? There must have been some indication.
Well, the indication was I knew that Mr. Segretti's activities were of a wide nature. I knew that he was going to other states. He showed me some of the literature that was used in different areas that perhaps I would recognize but didn't use myself. I knew his expenses must be quite high to be flying around the country this much. I just couldn't think of any other source, financial source, that would possibly be operating at that time. When I would refer to whether he was working for the White House or the Re-elect the President Committee, he would just say, I don't know. I'll explain after the election. I did know he had extensive activities, but I was not aware of who he was talking with. It was just my feeling of that. He never gave me an indication it wasn't that case. Plus the fact that I suspected Mr. Devant, now this was never clear, still I guess it is now, that Mr. Devant he had been in contact with, and I knew he was an advance man for President Nixon in 1968. So that was a correlation there.
And when you came to Washington, did you visit the White House?
No, sir.
Were you in touch with anyone working at the White House?
No, sir.
During your Washington trip?
No, sir.
Who else were you in touch with besides Mr. Segretti at that time?
Nobody.
That is all, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Senator Muskie. I mean, Senator
Garner. Oh, Mr. Chairman, now that you mentioned Senator Muskie, I would like to go back and clear up a point a little bit. Do you agree, Mr. Kelly, with most political analysts that perhaps the one thing that hurt Senator Muskie more than anything else was his emotional outburst in the New Hampshire primary?
I do.
And it's easily understandable why that happened. He's a proud and a sensitive man, as well as a fine senator. And of course that was precipitated by the Newsweek article, was it not?
Yes, sir.
The New Hampshire primary occurred, did it not, before the Florida primary?
Yes, sir. I think there was an article in the Boston Globe he was upset about, not simply the Newsweek article, in that instance you're referring to.
But in any event, it did involve
Involve
hatchet jobs on
Yes,
Mrs.
sir.
Muskie.
Yes, sir.
Very fine, a wonderful woman that the senator has every right to be proud of. And that's really what precipitated the emotional outburst in New Hampshire. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
And this occurred, as I say, before the distribution of these few reprints of the Newsweek article that you and your people made in Florida. Is that right?
Yes, sir. There were activities, I understand, going on before. I'm not sure if anything was done in New Hampshire or not. I'm not even completely sure if anything was done before that at all. In terms of sabotage, it's unclear, but there may have been. But I would agree to you that it was the attack on Mrs. Muskie that probably precipitated his crying.
Don't misunderstand my line of questioning. I in no way condone or approve of what you and your people were doing in Florida. I think this is a great injustice to the political system that we could do without completely, and politics and government would be much farther ahead. But I do like to try to present the true picture and the facts. And do you really feel that your activity really had any weight at all in deciding how people were going to vote in the state of Florida in the primary, the Democrat primary?
Possibly not in the state of Florida. I think it could have had some effect as to post-convention attitudes.
But I'm talking about the
Florida primary. No, sir, I don't believe there was a large effect as to the direct vote.
That's all.
Senator Inouye. Well, you don't think that the publication of the what so-called Canuck letter in New Hampshire and the activities of Donald Segretti and yourself in Florida were calculated to make Senator Muskie or any other man have a sweet disposition, do you?
Well, no, sir, I'm certainly it wouldn't. I'm certain it wouldn't.
In fact, they were intended to have exactly the opposite effect, weren't they?
That was the intention, yes, sir.
Just one or two questions. Mr. Kelly, with reference to that New Hampshire incident involving Senator Muskie, did you make reference to that incident in some of your literature that you handed out?
Yes, sir.
And could you just describe what that was to the committee?
Yes, I believe it was referred to in one of the flyers. I think it was the lunch flyer, the bogus lunch that was supposed to be held for Senator Muskie. I think it referred to something to the effect, "Come in here, Senator Muskie, explain why he broke down in New Hampshire." That was included on one of the flyers, yes, sir.
I take it you favor legislation in this area, and I would appreciate receiving, as I know the committee would, your ideas in this area. Would you also take into consideration, when you write that, if you could, what the possible impact or effect might be if you multiplied your activities throughout the state with other people doing similar things, and multiplied those kinds of statewide activities in other primary states? If you could also give us some judgment on that, I think we'd appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Full counsel takes up the thing. My experience has been in politics, and I've been in it a long time, that that one man can tell a lie about a candidate one day, then it's all over the community the next day. So I don't accept your theory that because you just put on 2 radio advertisements about Muskie's attitude towards Castro, that the repercussions of that stopped when you took the thing off because
yeah. No, sir. To repeat myself, there were, I'm sure, some effect of that, but that was not the direct...
In other words, it's just, in my experience, it's just like throwing a rock into a pond. The waves just keep going until they reach out with shores. And nothing seems to spread as fast as false rumors, false charges.
I have no question, Mr. Chairman.
The committee will stand in recess till 2 o'clock.
When the senators finished their questioning of Martin Kelly, they broke for lunch. The probe of dirty tricks in the Florida primary moved from Miami to Tampa when they resumed. The new witness was Robert Benz, former president of the Young Republican Club in Tampa.